Knock, knock, motherfucker. It's the United States of America, and I hear you guys got oil that isn't under my possession.
All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to live show 172, War Beyond Control. All right. We're coming to you live tonight from the great capital of Belarus, Minsk, that stubborn little place the Western political class still can't seem to fix. For years now, they've been trying the usual playbook: colour revolutions, sanctions, media campaigns, and a parade of self-appointed leaders for Belarus, broadcasting from comfortable studios in Poland and Lithuania. Yet somehow, despite all that effort, the country keeps stubbornly refusing to collapse on schedule. Maybe it's because the people here have looked westward and noticed what the upgrade package usually includes: a friendly Rothschild-style central bank, a society run by gambling apps and pharmaceutical ads, social media full of OnlyFans influencers, mass immigration chaos, rising crime, drag queen story hour in primary schools, experimental mRNA shots every season, gender clinics for kids, and food sprayed with enough glyphosate to glow in the dark. Strangely enough, when that's the sales pitch for your next EU-approved democratic transition, a lot of Belarusians seem perfectly happy sticking with President Lukashenko and the system they already know. Which is probably why, much to the frustration of the professional revolution managers in Brussels and Washington, the grand Belarus regime change project keeps failing. And judging by the last few years, it's going to keep failing. And talking about attempted regime changes, tonight we're going to talk about something that a lot of people are getting completely wrong. Because if you listen to the television, if you listen to the think tank crowd, if you listen to the usual parade of experts, they're all analysing this war like it's 1991. Bigger military wins, better jets win, more bombs wins. Case closed. Except that's not the world we're living in anymore, because what is unfolding right now between the United States, Israel and Iran is not just a conventional war, it's a systematic war. Military pressure, economic chokepoints, religious narratives, political manipulation, escalation traps, all running at the same time. And the really dangerous part is that the side with the biggest hammer is not automatically the side in control. Tonight we're going to break this down into two parts. First, we're going to look at the strategic mechanics of the war itself. While power does not equal control, why escalation matters more than dominance, and why there is three questions that will determine how this war ends. And then in the second segment, we're going to go somewhere most geopolitical analysts refuse to go, into the religious dimension. Because when you start looking at Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa, and the competing end of history narratives across multiple civilizations, suddenly a lot of the behavior we are seeing starts making a lot more sense. And it also becomes a lot more dangerous because the strategy and the scripture start overlapping, and history tends to move very fast. Tonight this show is sponsored by the Quantum Hemisphere's The Rise of Arco, the first book in a powerful new science fiction trilogy exploring the collapse of the nation state and the emergence of a new kind of global order built around infrastructure systems, logistics networks, orbital platforms, and AI-assisted governance. Set in the near future where traditional politics can no longer manage the complexity of the connected planet, The Rise of Arco follows the creation of a radical new framework designed to stabilize Earth's critical systems, energy, trade, transport, and space, as the old geopolitical order begins to fracture. It's a cinematic political science fiction story about power, systems, and the struggle to control the infrastructure that holds civilization together. The Quantum Hemispheres, The Rise of Arco, is now available across the planet on Amazon, starting from just $16.99 in the United States. And it's, like I said, it's available on Amazon everywhere. Check it out and see where the future might be heading. So, tonight, grab a drink, sit back, and let's start with the hard strategic reality that most analysts still refuse to say out loud. Control over dominance. All right, let's get into this properly. The war between the United States, Israel, and Iran is being sold to the people in the usual way, as a simple contest of power. Bigger military, better weapons, more advanced air force, more technology, therefore automatic victory. That is the sales pitch, but that is not the actual core issue. The real issue is not who has the biggest hammer. The real issue is whether overwhelming destructive power still guarantees a political victory in a war shaped by endurance, calibration, escalation, narrative, economics, and strategic manipulation. And that is where the whole thing gets a lot more dangerous, because there is really three questions sitting over this war that matter more than anything else. Question 1. Will the United States eventually send in ground troops? Question 2. Will nuclear weapons be used? Question 3. Will this war expand into a much wider religious confrontation centered on the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem? Those three questions do not just determine the outcome of this war. They determine what kind of world comes after it. Because this is not just about battlefield tactics. This is about imperial overstretch. This is about whether the nuclear taboo survives. And this is about whether a regional war mutates into a mass religious mobilization across the Islamic world. And the core argument here is simple. Control matters more than dominance. That is the big idea. Just because you have the most destructive weapons does not mean you are in control. Strategic flexibility matters more. Political discipline matters more. The ability to calibrate escalation matters more. The ability to shape how allies, enemies, and spectators see the war matters more. In other words, the side with the most firepower is not automatically the side with the strongest position. And that is the mistake a lot of people make. Now let's start with the first big issue, the ground invasion. As long as this stays mostly an air war, Washington still has an exit. It can scale down. It can reframe the mission. It can claim some limited objective. And then eventually it can withdraw. It would be a defeat, yes. It would be humiliating, yes. But it would not be necessarily catastrophic. Air wars leave room for retreat. They leave room for ambiguity. They leave room for the usual political trickery where leaders pretend they achieve something and then quietly step back. But a ground war changes all that. The moment large numbers of American troops enter Iranian territory, the whole thing changes character. Then it is not longer a standoff campaign. It becomes a land war against a large, politically hardened state with difficult geography, ideological cohesion, and decades of experience surviving sanctions, covert warfare, regional hostility, and outside pressure. And once that begins, it is not a quick job. It is not a 6 weeks cleanup operation. It is not some neat cinematic campaign. It becomes a trap, a multi-year trap, and the costs inside the United States would go through the roof. Casualties rise, political resistance rises, social division rises, and if manpower demand increases enough, then the pressure for some kind of draft or mass mobilization becomes real. And here is the ugly part. Even if America wins battles on the ground, it can still lose strategically. Because if you need years of occupation, years of attrition, years of political exhaustion, then your victory becomes a disaster. That is why mission creep matters so much. These wars never begin with politicians saying openly, "Right, lads, we're going to occupy this place for the next 10 years and bleed ourselves dry." They do not say that. They start small, a limited strike, a narrow mission, a temporary deployment, a short-term objective. And then the first thing fails, so they send more. Then that fails, so they escalate again. And before long, what was sold as a manageable intervention becomes a national trauma. That is how empires get trapped. Not usually by one giant decision, but by a long chain of smaller ones that slowly close every exit. And the second big issue is nuclear weapons. Anytime a conventional war starts going badly or looks unstable, people immediately begin talking about nukes. And yes, that fear is understandable. But the argument here is that the nuclear issue is not imminent. And the reason is simple. Wars do not simply jump straight from conventional fighting to nuclear apocalypse. They escalate in stages. And every one of those stages has to be politically justified, psychologically prepared, and strategically managed. Escalation is not just about what a state can do. It is about what it can do while still holding together public opinion, military morale, allied support, and some kind of international legitimacy. That is the key point. Nuclear weapons are not just constrained by capability, they are constrained by taboo. Since Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, nuclear weapons have sat in a category of their own. And that taboo is not just moral language. It is built into diplomacy, military thinking, alliance management, public fear, and the understanding that once that line is crossed, the whole framework of restraint starts to collapse. A tactical nuclear strike would not stay tactical in political means. That is the point. It would announce to the world that the old boundaries are gone, so the argument is that nukes are not just the next step. They are much, much later. Before that, you usually see other levels of escalation first. Leadership strikes, military attacks, embargoes, infrastructure destruction, covert systems, possibly unconventional weapons. If those stages have not played out, then the nuclear threshold is still farther away than panic merchants want people to believe. So the key thing here is sequencing, not raw capability. States do not just use bigger weapons because they have it. They have to justify every move to their own public, to their allies, to their troops, and to the wider world. And that takes us to a bigger theory behind all this. Dominance versus control. A lot of conventional strategic thinking is obsessed with something called escalation dominance. The basic idea is simple. The side that can climb higher on the ladder of violence has the advantage. And in a narrow technical sense, yes, the United States and Israel clearly have that advantage over Iran. More advanced systems, more military reach, and in Israel's case, nuclear deterrence sitting in the background. But the argument here is that this way of thinking gets the real dynamics wrong. Because you can have overwhelming destructive capability and still strategically be clumsy. You can be more powerful and still be easier to manipulate. Control is something different. Control means calibration. It means using the right level of force at the right moment for the right political effect. It means keeping focus, clarity, and resolve while pulling your opponent into overreaction. It means making every strike serve a larger strategic purpose, not just destruction for the sake of destruction. A disciplined actor does not simply lash out. It acts in a way that strengthens its narrative, isolates its opponent, keeps options open, and makes outside audience seem more sympathetic. That is what the real control looks like, and this is where the bully example becomes useful. So imagine a bully in school. Everyone thinks he is powerful because nobody resists him. His authority rests on credibility. People believe that if you challenge him, he will crush you. But that creates a weakness. If someone challenges him in a controlled, strategic way, the bully faces a dilemma. If he backs down, he loses face. If he escalates too hard, He reveals insecurity, alienates observers, and exposes how fragile his authority really is. This is how stronger actors can be manipulated. Their power traps them. They must constantly prove themselves. And that need for consistent proof makes them predictable. The weaker actor, if disciplined enough, becomes the active player. He chooses the timing. He chooses the pressure points. He decides when to provoke and when to hold back. And suddenly the so-called stronger side is reacting. That is the theory being applied to this war. The American and Israeli approach is blunt. It follows a familiar pattern. Leadership decapitation, strikes on military targets, economic pressure, then pressure on civilian infrastructure. The assumption is that if you hit hard enough, you break the state, split the population from the government, and force internal collapse. But history shows this is often it does the opposite. External pressure can harden internal unity. It can strengthen nationalism. It can convince the people that however much they dislike their government, survival now depends on standing with it. That is one of the biggest mistakes outside powers keep making. Now, Iran's position looks different, not because it has more power, it obviously does not, but because it is has more selective options. It can target military systems, it can pressure shipping, it can disrupt energy flows, it can exploit Gulf vulnerabilities, it can vary the intensity of retaliation depending on what surrounding states do. And the Strait of Hormuz sits right at the center of this logic. That narrow corridor matters because so much global energy trade runs through it. So any disruption there affects not just Iran and America, it affects Gulf monarchies, it affects Asian importers, it affects global markets. That means a state with leverage over that choke point does not need nuclear dominance to create strategic pressure. It just needs enough control to make everyone else fear the economic consequences of continuing the war. That is why this conflict cannot be understood just as a military contest. The war is being fought in multiple dimensions at once. Narrative, political, economic, military. Narrative determines legitimacy. Political positioning shapes alliances, diplomatic room, and internal cohesion. Economic pressure shapes endurance trade and the choices of outside states. Military operations sit inside that larger framework. They do not float above it. You can win battles and lose politically. You can dominate the skies and still fail strategically. You can destroy infrastructure and strengthen the will of the other side. That is the reality. And from an angle, Iran has several strategic advantages despite being materially weaker. First, it is more active. It can choose how and when to impose pain. Second, it has clear objective. It wants the United States pushed out of the Middle East. It wants American military infrastructure weakened. It wants greater leverage over trade and regional security. The American objective, by contrast, is vague. Destroy Iran. All right, what does that actually mean? Regime change, economic collapse, state fragmentation, civilization starvation, symbolic punishment. That is not a coherent strategy. That is a slogan. And when the end state is vague, the military plan becomes confused, then becomes flexibility. Iran can calibrate. It can strike some targets and spare others. It can pressure some states and accommodate others. It can use economic choke points as political leverage. The United States, by contrast, is stuck in a narrower and more rigid decision tree built around air power and cohesive punishment. That is the rigidity matters, because rigid powers are easier to draw into escalations they do not originally want. And that is the logic behind the prediction that American ground troops eventually get committed. Not necessarily because Washington wanted a giant invasion on day one, but because the structure of the war pushes it in that direction. If airstrikes do not produce decisive political results, then what next? If the enemy does not collapse, if the government does not fall, if the population does not turn, If the region does not submit, what next? You move towards ground operations. That is how logic develops. And this is where the old reality of attritional warfare comes back in. Infantry is cheap, armour is more expensive, naval systems more expensive still, air power most expensive of all. The military that leans too heavily on costly high-tech platforms can create spectacular destruction, yes. But it struggles in a prolonged war if it lacks the manpower structure for sustained fighting, occupation and replenishment. That is the illusion post-Cold War America got trapped in. The Gulf War in 1991 and the Iraq in 2003 encouraged the belief that high-tech war could solve everything quickly. Precision bombing, air superiority, shock and awe, fast collapse. But those wars were against much weaker opponents. They created the illusion that old-fashioned attritional land war was obsolete. Against Iran, that illusion breaks. If the objective is real victory, not just punishment from a distance, then the logic of land warfare comes back hard. Mass matters, manpower matters, logistics matter, occupation capacity matters. So that is why the prediction is not just merely that ground troops are possible, it is that they become structurally likely if the war drags on. Now, widen this out. There are four major players in this framework: the United States, Iran, Israel and Saudi Arabia. The American goal is presented simply as the destruction of Iran in order to preserve leverage over Middle Eastern oil flows and therefore preserve wider global power. Iran's objectives are layered: control Hormuz, weaken or destroy the US military position in the region, humble Israel without triggering a nuclear retaliation. Israel interests overlap with Washington's, but they're not identical. That matters, because allies do not always want the same end state. A prolonged war that drains America and destroys Iran could leave Israel as the strongest military actor in the region. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, is seen as the wanting a conflict in which Iran, the United States, and Israel all weaken one another enough for Saudi Arabia to improve its long-term position. Whether people like that interpretation or not, the large strategic point stands. Allies do not always share the same final objective. They may cooperate tactically while quietly aiming at different futures, and that makes the war far more unstable. A coalition partner can push escalation not because it wants immediate victory, but because a drawn-out conflict changes the regional balance in its favor. Once you understand that, the absence of nuclear use becomes easier to explain. A nuclear strike ends things too abruptly. It collapses bargaining space. It creates uncontrollable consequences. A long conventional war, on the other hand, can be exploited politically. That same logic explains why a Venezuela scenario is not seen as workable in Iran. In places where elites are deeply tied into Western systems, financially, socially, politically, regime decapitation can create opportunities for surrender, transition, or compromise. But Iran is different in this argument. Its elite has spent decades under sanctions, pressure, exclusion, and ideological hardening that can make a system poorer and harsher. But it can also make it more cohesive in opposition to outside coercion. So killing leaders do not necessarily produce collapse. It can just intensify unity at the top. Now, the broader American motivation is then explained through a classic geopolitical idea: prevent the Eurasian heartland from consolidating. A theory that is the biggest threat to a maritime empire is a unified land bloc stretching from Europe, Asia, Central Asia, Middle East, and East Asia. Why? Because a naval hegemony depends on sea routes, chokepoints, and fragmentation among continental powers. If the major Eurasian states integrate by land through rail, energy corridors, strategic coordination, and internal trade, then maritime leverage weakens. And in that framework, coordination blocks involving Russia, China, Iran, and others become a direct threat to American hegemony. So destroying Iran is not only about Iran. It is about breaking a wider continental alignment. It is about preserving a sea-based imperial order. That is why the war is seen as systemic rather than local. If the conflict touches global trade, alliances, structures, energy routes, and hegemonic credibility, then Washington may accept risks that would otherwise look insane. And that is the key imperial pattern. Great powers do not always avoid risk when the systems look fragile. Sometimes they become more dangerous precisely because they believe inaction would accelerate decline. Now, Saudi Arabia enters this with its own anxieties. It is a monarchy heavily dependent on oil revenue. It has long relied on American protection, and it faces a future of energy transition, economic uncertainty, and regional rivalry. Its conflict with Iran is not just about territory or influence. It's sectarian. It is ideological. It is theological. It is about rival claims to legitimacy in the Islamic world. Iran's revolutionary theocracy and Saudi Arabia's monarchy are competing models of religious political authority. That is why the rivalry is so deep, and this is the reading. Saudi Arabia's strategy is shaped by fear. Fear that passivity leads to decline. Fear that waiting means watching the regional order harden against it. So, even if the outcome is uncertain, the kingdom sees chaos as potentially more useful than stagnation. And then we get to the most explosive issue of all, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is the point where geopolitics can turn into something much bigger. Because Al-Aqsa is not just another site, it is one of the holiest places in Islam. It is tied to the Prophet Muhammad's night journey and ascension. At the same time, it sits on the ground of immense significance in the Jewish history and theology. So any threat to that site carries the potential to turn a regional war into a civilizational rupture. If Al-Aqsa was destroyed or desecrated in a way widely seen as intentional, the consequences would be enormous. States that might otherwise prefer caution could come under overwhelming public pressure. What had been a strategic war over power and trade could suddenly become a religious war with much wider mobilization. That is why this question sits above so much else, because once a war moves fully into sacred obligation territory, the scale changes. Now, the conflict becomes totalizing in another way. And that brings us to the last point. As wars deepen, focus, clarity, and resolve do not stay abstract concepts. They become social reality. Unity, censorship, militarization, information control. The deeper the war gets, the more states demand obedience. Images get controlled. Dissent gets treated as sabotage. The economy bends towards war. Citizens get fooled into the war effort psychologically, materially, ideologically. Total war does not begin only when millions are in uniform. It begins when all public life is subordinated to military necessity. And that is where this is heading if it keeps escalating. So the paradox at the center of all this is simple. The side with the greatest destructive power is not necessarily the side with the greatest strategic advantage. The actor that can calibrate better, absorb pressure better, exploit chokepoints better, shape perceptions better, and manipulate the escalation choices of others better, that actor can force stronger rivals into self-defeating commitments. And that is the logic behind the three forecasts. 1. American ground troops eventually enter the war. 2. Nuclear weapons are not used in the near term. 3. The struggle around Al-Aqsa Mosque becomes the most dangerous trigger for a much wider conflict. Now, whether people agree with this every single part of this framework or not, the central warning is still powerful. Wars are not won by firepower alone. They are won or lost through political discipline, strategic clarity, endurance, legitimacy, and the control of escalation across multiple domains at once. And the real danger in the US-Iran war is not only destruction, it is misreading the nature of the war itself. It is the belief that superior weapons automatically means superior control. It is the belief that coercion automatically produces submission. It is the belief that a conflict can keep escalating without fundamentally changing the political and religious landscape around it. If those assumptions are wrong, then the consequences go beyond Iran. A trapped America, a radicalized region, broken norms around escalation, and possibly ignition of a much broader religious confrontation. That would not just be another Middle Eastern war. That would be the turning point in a global order. And that is why these three questions matter so much. They are not just military questions. They are really questions about whether the existing system of power can survive the methods it is using to preserve itself. Scripture shapes strategy. So alright, let's walk through this carefully, because if you look at this war only through the normal geopolitical lens, armies, oil, alliances, missiles, a lot of what's happening simply does not make sense. If you look at escalation, you look at the risks, you look at the lack of clear objectives, and the obvious question becomes, why would anyone run this sort of risk? From a purely military perspective, from a purely economic perspective, a lot of the moves we're seeing are irrational. But if you step back and look at this through another lens, the religious lens, the escological lens, the end of history narratives that exist inside multiple civilizations, suddenly the behavior starts to make a lot more sense. And that's the key point here, because there are three major questions that determine how this war unfolds, what it ultimately looks like, and how the global system changes afterwards. And based on that framework, there are three predictions. First, the United States will eventually use ground troops in this war. And if that happens, the United States will almost certainly have to implement the national draft. Second, despite the escalation, the United States and Israel will not use tactical nuclear weapons in this war. And third prediction is the most controversial one. The Al-Aqsa Mosque will be destroyed during this war. That sounds extreme, but if you understand the deeper forces involved, it becomes easier to see why someone would reach that conclusion. Before getting into this theory behind it, it's most important to look at some of the signals coming out of the political system. One example comes from the briefings in Washington. After one classified briefing about the war, a senior US senator publicly stated that he left the meeting angrier and more dissatisfied than any briefing in 15 years. Why? Because the administration could not answer basic questions. What are the objectives? What is the cost? How long will the war last? When a government cannot answer those questions, it usually means one thing: the war has no defined end state, and that means the commitment is open-ended. The second point raises in that briefing was more serious. There is already a path being discussed towards deploying American ground troops inside Iran, and if that happens, it would almost certainly require mobilizing far more soldiers than the current volunteer force can provide, which brings us back to the possibility of a national draft. The third warning was geopolitical. There are indications that Russia is already aiding Iran in certain ways, and why wouldn't it, as America has been helping Ukraine the same. So this is not just a regional fight, this is a conflict that could very easily widen. Now look at the Iranian response to the idea of American ground troops. When Iranian officials were asked whether they feared a US invasion, the answer was striking. They said, "We are waiting for them." That response shocked the interviewer, because the expectation is much of Washington is that the United States military is overwhelming and the adversaries fear direct confrontation. But Iran's response was essentially, "Come in. We've spent 20 years preparing for this." And that highlights something important. Inside the Washington policy environment, there is often a bubble, a consensus, an echo chamber. Everyone assumes the same outcomes. Everyone assumes the same superiority. and sometimes that means the possibility of losing a war is never seriously considered. History shows this pattern repeatedly. Empires often begin wars believing victory is inevitable until reality intervenes. And here is where the analysis shifts. Because if we look purely at geopolitics, oil routes, regional alliances, military power, this war still doesn't fully make sense. But when you add religious narratives into the picture, the logic begins to change. Jerusalem sits at the center of three major religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And at the center of Jerusalem is one of the most sensitive religious sites on earth, the Temple Mount. For Muslims, it contains the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. For Jews, it is associated with the first and second temples and the long-standing hope that the third temple could eventually be rebuilt. For certain strands of Christian theology, especially among those evangelical traditions, events surrounding Jerusalem are tied to end times prophecies. That makes this location extraordinarily volatile. Even a small political changes there have historically triggered the unrest across the entire Middle East. Now, within Judaism, like every religion, there are many different interpretations. The mainstream view is spiritual and patient. Redemption comes when God wills it. Human beings focus on moral improvement and humility and obedience. But there are also fringe movements that believe something very different. They believe redemption should not be passively awaited. They believe it should be accelerated. In this view, human action can help bring about the Messianic age. That includes restoring Jewish sovereignty, gathering the diaspora, and eventually rebuilding the temple. Most Jews reject the interpretation. They consider it extreme. But historically, small ideological groups can still influence politics when they are highly organized and deeply committed. And that's where the concept of escological convergence comes in. Escology means the story of how the world ends. Every civilization has one, and these stories are incredibly powerful because they answer three fundamental human questions: where do we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going? Those stories become a kind of operating system for civilization. They shape identity. They shape motivation. They shape political behavior. If you want to understand how groups behave over long periods of time, one way to do that is examine their narratives, especially their end of history narratives. From a game theory perspective, success in conflict depends on three variables: mass, energy, and coordination. Mass is numbers. Energy is motivation, focus, willingness to act. And the most important variable is coordination. A smaller group that is highly coordinated can defeat a larger group that is divided. And the most powerful mechanism for coordination in human history is shared narrative, a story that tells everyone the role they play, what sacrifice is required, and what victory looks like. Escology is the ultimate version of that narrative because it provides a complete script. People believe they know where history is heading and what they must do to reach that destination. Now, when you look at different civilizations, you begin to see something different and something interesting. Different religions have different escologies, but sometimes they intersect. For example, ancient Persian traditions speak of the final struggle between truth and falsehood, light and darkness, followed by a final judgment. Jewish traditions contain narratives about redemption, exile, the return of Jerusalem, and the eventual arrival of the Messiah. Certain Christian traditions interpret biblical prophecy to mean that events in Israel and Jerusalem will trigger the final global confrontation. Islamic traditions also contain eschatological narratives involving a struggle against deception and the arrival of a righteous leader. Russian Orthodox traditions include the idea of Moscow as the third Rome, the final center of Christian civilization after Rome and Constantinople. Each of these traditions is complex and diverse, but when you examine their most extreme interpretations, something interesting appears. certain events become focal points. Jerusalem, the temple, a final war sometimes described as Gog and Magog, and the collapse of transformation of existing global powers. When analysts talk about escological convergence, they are describing moments where these different narratives begin pointing towards similar historical turning points. That doesn't mean everyone believes in the same thing. It means multiple ideological systems begin moving towards the same dramatic events. And when those narratives start influencing political actors, geopolitics becomes extremely unpredictable. Now add the economic dimension. Iran sits on the northern side of the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important energy choke points in the world. Much of the oil exported by the Gulf states passes through that narrow corridor. If that route is contested or blocked, global energy markets are immediately affected. But the Gulf states also depend heavily on maritime trade for food imports. If shipping is disrupted, their economic model becomes extremely vulnerable. So, if the United States were to withdraw completely from the region while Iran retained control of the strategic choke point, the balance of power could shift dramatically. Iran could potentially gain leverage over its neighbours. That would change the entire financial flow of the region. Money that once flowed towards Western financial systems could begin flowing elsewhere. Which raises a serious question. Could the United States simply walk away from the conflict? The argument presented here is that it becomes extremely difficult because withdrawal could trigger economic consequences that rebound back into the American domestic system. Financial instability, political unrest, loss of strategic influence. At that point, escalation may appear politically easier than retreat. If escalation carries enormous risks, then that is one of the tragic patterns of history. Wars often become self-sustaining systems. Once they begin, they create economic and political pressures that make them very hard to stop. So when people ask whether this war might expand, the uncomfortable answer is, it might. Ground troops could enter the conflict. Regional powers like Turkey or Saudi Arabia could become more deeply involved. The economic model of the Gulf could suffer major damage, and the global geopolitical order could begin to shift in ways that no one fully controls. Whether these outcomes occur because of strategic planning, ideological narratives, or simply political mistakes is almost secondary, because once the process begins, the consequences tend to unfold according to their own logic. And that is why this conflict matters far beyond the Middle East. It sits at the intersection of religion, geopolitics, economics, and civilizational identity. If those forces continue converging, the result will not simply be another regional war. It could become one of the most defining turning points of the 21st century. And that is why understanding the deeper narratives behind this conflict is essential, because sometimes wars are not driven by only strategy. Sometimes scripture shapes strategy. Okay, all right, so that's where we are tonight. Two lenses, two ways of looking at the same war. The first, the strategic lens, power versus control, escalation versus discipline, and the uncomfortable reality that having the biggest military in the world does not automatically mean you control how the war unfolds. The second lens is the civilizational lens, deeper narratives, the religious geography, the ancient stories that still sit underneath modern politics, whether policy makers admit it or not. And when those two layers start interacting, military strategy on one side, escological belief on the other, that is when history becomes extremely unstable, because wars stop being about territory or oil, they start being about destiny. And wars fought in the name of destiny are the ones that tend to spiral fastest. Now that may be for some of these predictions turn out to be wrong. Maybe the ground invasion never happens. Maybe escalation stabilizes. Maybe the sacred sites never become a trigger point. Let's hope so. But the reason we talk about this now is because if those assumptions are wrong, then the consequences will not just reshape the Middle East, they will reshape the entire global order. So we will keep watching this closely, because the next move in this war are going to tell us a lot where about the world is heading. And this show was sponsored by The Quantum Hemispheres, The Rise of Arco, the first book in a powerful new science fiction trilogy exploring the collapse of a nation state and the emergence of a new kind of global order built around infrastructure, systems, logistic networks, orbital platforms, and AI-assisted governance. Set in the near future where traditional politics can no longer manage the complexity of a connected planet. The Rise of Arco follows the creation of a radical new framework designed to stabilize Earth's critical systems, energy, trade, transport, and space, as the old geopolitical order begins to fracture. It's a cinematic political science fiction story about power, systems, and the struggle to control the infrastructure that holds civilization together. The Quantum Hemispheres, The Rise of Arco, is now available across the planet on Amazon, starting from just $16.99 in the United States, and I think around £12 or £13 in the UK, and probably €16 in Europe, something like that. Check it out on Amazon in your local area, country, and also see where the future might be heading. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoyed tonight's breakdown, hit that like button, share the stream, subscribe if you're new, and I will see you on the other side. Bye.